Now to continue, in the light of the Epicurean and Stoic advocacy of emotionlessness and withdrawal, you might think that things are in a pretty bad state. But even though Epicurus and the Stoics have in effect given up this world and said that you cannot achieve values here, they still, both schools, retain one firm tie to reality. Both believe in the efficacy of the human mind. Both believe that knowledge is possible by reason, whether they construe that in the Platonic or the Aristotelian fashion. Neither school, therefore, ever became religions in the sense of demanding faith or appealing to revelation or having a sacred text or a priesthood. For that to occur, one last thing had to go, and that is man's mind, his confidence in his ability to reach the truth by reason and logic. And this confidence was the target of the next post-Aristotelian school, the Skeptics. If they succeed in their attempt, you will recognize that all is lost, that pagan philosophy is dead, and a new age is about to dawn. Now, if Epicurus is a derivative of the atomists and the Stoics of the Platonists, the Skeptics are a derivative of the Sophists. They are a school of thinkers also stretching across centuries. Again, they started in Greece and moved to Rome. The founder is Pyrrho, P-Y-R-R-H-O, Pyrrho of Elis, from which we get the adjective Pyrrhonian skepticism. His dates I have seen in many, many versions, but something like 360 BC to 270 BC. So he was a contemporary of Zeno and Epicurus. You probably haven't heard of any of the skeptics. They're not much better known than the Stoics. Arcesilaus, essentially 3rd century BC. Carneades, 2nd century BC. Anicedemus, 1st century BC. Sextus Empiricus, about 200 AD he flourished. Those are the main ones. Now, the skeptics held that knowledge of anything is impossible. That's it? Even this, they stated, was not knowledge. You can be certain of nothing. The name comes from a Greek verb, skeptisthai, which means actually to examine carefully, to investigate, to inquire. And they were always inquiring and never finding anything. And so they came to be called the perpetual inquirers, as against the finders, you see. And finally, the word skeptic acquired our modern meaning. Why is no knowledge possible? Well, the skeptics developed a whole arsenal of arguments. For instance, on the senses, they developed at great length Protagoras' primary argument. Remember that perception depends on your sensory apparatus. Therefore, you don't perceive reality directly, only the subjective effects on your organs. Well, the skeptics, and I always use that now with a capital S as a school, said that perception varies with the species of entity perceiving. Men and dogs don't necessarily perceive the object the same way. It varies depending upon the specific individual within a species, for instance, the normal man versus the colorblind man. It varies with the bodily conditions of an individual. You know how you see spots before your eyes if you have certain sicknesses? The various senses of the same individual at the same time might conflict with each other. So, for instance, the classic case, if you have a cavity in your tooth, your sense of sight tells you it's tiny, and your sense of touch, as mediated by the tongue, tells you it's huge. Your sense perception varies with your different relations to the object. The tracks up close, the railroad tracks, seem to be parallel. At a distance, they seem to converge. Your perception depends on the medium between the object and you. For instance, the air through which the various waves travel. How do you know what the medium adds that distorts? All of these and many, many more, all of it, as you see, variations on the theme and the basic argument of Protagoras. In sum, They said we never perceive things as they are. Our perceptions are influenced by all sorts of outside factors besides the nature of the object. We have no means of distinguishing true perceptions from false ones because we never get to see the object directly, and therefore have no means of comparing the object with our experience. We're trapped in our own world of subjective experiences. Reality, therefore, is unknowable, and some of them added, what makes you think there is a reality if you never perceive it? All you perceive is a flux of subjective impressions. How can you ever go from that to something unperceivable beyond it? Maybe it's all just a dream or a hallucination, etc. What about reason as against the senses? Well, of course, they said, first of all, reason is based on the senses, so it's no better off than the senses. And then they used the argument from disagreement that all skeptics at all times use. Everybody, they said, claims to have the answers. Everybody claims to have refuted his opponent. Nobody agrees. The Stoics are teleologists, the Epicureans are mechanists. The Stoics are determinists, the Epicureans are indeterminists. The Platonists stress universals and the Aristotelians stress particulars, etc., etc. Who is to know? Doesn't it prove that man's reason is simply incapable of objective knowledge? And as far as ethics goes, all they had to do is take all the stories of the returning travelers as to how the barbarians lived, which is radically different from the way the Greeks or the Romans lived. And that goes to show there's no agreement on ethics any more than in metaphysics and epistemology. Now, there are many more arguments than just these. For instance, there was an argument directed by many skeptics against the idea of axioms or first principles. They denied the objectivity of self-evident truths. Consequently, they said to have knowledge, we'd have to have an infinite regress. And therefore, since we can't do that, reasoning can never lead us to knowledge because we can't arrive at objective first principles. Some of them contested the law of cause and effect on grounds very, very close to that which Hume in the 18th century became famous for, in particular Anicedemus, who was a Heraclitean skeptic, anticipated Hume's argument, and followers of Hume therefore loved to dig him up and show how venerable Hume's argument was. He argued, in effect, you can't never perceive by your senses a causal connection, and therefore what basis do you have for believing in one? And of course, therefore, there's no justification for induction. How can you generalize if there is no causal laws? And of course, there's a whole standard array of skeptic arguments. You put forth an argument and the skeptic says to you, how do you know you're not crazy? After all, it's possible. Human beings become insane. They have delusions. Maybe you're having one. Prove that you're not. How do you know you didn't commit a mistake? It's possible. Human beings make errors. Prove that you didn't. How do you know you're not dreaming? How do you know you're not hallucinating, etc.? Now, Descartes in the 17th century attempts once and for all to answer all of these skeptic arguments, so we will wait until that time to discuss them. And as you'll see, Descartes makes it much worse rather than making it better. Some skeptics attacked the syllogism on the grounds that it was an inherently fallacious means of reasoning. If you're interested, you can ask me in the question period what was their argument which had enduring influence and what's wrong with it. Sextus Empiricus in particular launched an attack on universals as the earlier sophists had done. There were no such things. Universals are a myth, he said, whether Platonist or Aristotelian. And of course, that subverts the whole foundation of conceptual thought and therefore of induction again. There's no way to justify generalizations if you can't justify abstractions. And of course, the skeptics delighted in paradoxes. The most famous is the so-called liar paradox. Now get this one. Epimenides the Cretan comes up to you. That's the classic example. Comes up to you and he says, I am a liar. Meaning, I'm a universal liar. Everything I say is a lie. Everything I say is false. Including, of course, that statement. Now the skeptics say, is his statement, I am a liar, true or false? And you're trapped whichever way you turn. If you say it's true, then the skeptic says, well, if it's true and it says it's a lie, then it's false. If it's true, it's false. But if it's false, then it's false that it's a lie. It's false that it's false. In other words, it's true. So if it's false, it's true. So they say here we have a statement which is such that if it's true, it's false, and if it's false, it's true. So much for human logic. A very popular paradox among later logicians, made much of by the Bertrand Russell mentality. What is wrong with this? The question period, if you're interested. On the question of God, skeptics, of course, are agnostics. Now, I might mention in passing that not all the skeptics were content simply to negate knowledge across the board. Carneades, in particular, was one of the first in philosophy to stress that even though certainty is unattainable, probability is possible, degrees of probability. And he is thus the real father of all those modern skeptics who say, in being a skeptic, we don't reduce ourselves to tabula rasa babies completely ignorant of everything. We simply deny certainty and take the middle ground between ignorance and certainty, namely probability. What's wrong with this? Question period if you're interested. The upshot is no knowledge is possible, and one commentator summarizes it as follows. Hence, our attitude to things ought to be complete suspense of judgment. We can be certain of nothing, not even of the most trivial assertions. Therefore, we ought never to make any positive statements on any subject. And the Pyrrhonists were careful, the followers of Pyrrho, were careful to import an element of doubt even into the most trifling assertions which they might make in the course of their daily life. They did not say, it is so, but it seems so, or it appears so to me. Every observation would be prefixed with a perhaps or it may be, unquote. And here's a quote from Arcesilaus, quote, I am certain of nothing. I am not even certain that I am certain of nothing, unquote. Skeptics are always easy school to deal with because since they know nothing, you can breeze through them very rapidly. As to ethics, well, of course, for most of the skeptics, ethics is a completely subjective matter, but some of them worked out an ethics of a sort as follows. Harking back to Socrates, who had said virtue is knowledge, that knowledge is the crucial, indispensable precondition of ethics, and since there was ethics, Socrates said there must be knowledge, the skeptics just took the reverse view. True enough, they said, knowledge is the indispensable precondition of ethics, but since there is no knowledge, it follows that there is no ethics. There is never, they said, or many of them said, a rational ground for preferring one course of action to another. What should the wise man do then? The wise man being the man who knows that nothing can be known. He should resist the seducements to which the mass of men are subject. After all, action proceeds from our ideas. Right action from right ideas. Wrong, harmful action from wrong ideas. The wise man, however, knows that you can assent to no ideas, knows that you can never affirm any idea, and therefore restrains himself from having any idea, and therefore from taking any action, as much as he can. He withdraws into himself and suspends judgment, and thereby is preserved from having to act. He therefore also achieves apathy, calmness, tranquility, rest within himself, quiet indifference. And you see therefore that the skeptics come to the same end as the Epicureans and the Stoics. To the extent to which a man must act, many of them said, he simply has to do what appears subjectively to him or conform to the mores of the society around him. And some of the ancient skeptics were actual priests in various religions on the ground that you couldn't prove they were wrong to be priests. It's all a matter of opinion, and it was very convenient. It seemed to be very convenient sometimes to be a priest. So much for the skeptics. Now you see how all these schools, the Epicureans, the Stoics, the skeptics, are converging on the same conclusion. The helplessness of man and the hopelessness of life. Each of these schools in its own way is ripening man for the onset of a religious era. Each is sapping man's confidence in some vital area and preparing him to fall to his knees and seek divine guidance, divine knowledge, otherworldly happiness. We are now on the threshold of man's descent into the medieval abyss. We see philosophy progressively losing confidence. Man's mind is no longer regarded as capable of gaining knowledge. Senses are invalid. Reason is precarious, unreliable. Life on earth is hell, inherently painful, malevolent. We have to give up the hope of happiness on earth. We are frightened, helpless creatures. This was progressively, century by century, more intensely the trend. We are caught in a world we cannot deal with or understand or function successfully. We are strangers and afraid in a world we never made. Progressively, the quest was for salvation. And progressively, it was felt men cannot achieve this on their own here on earth, as even the most pessimistic Stoics had thought. Salvation depends, it came to be held, on looking to another reality, a true, perfect reality, a reality of which this world in which we live is simply a shadow, a reflection, a semi-real, insignificant byproduct. Knowledge, it came to be held, depends upon contact with and special help from this superior reality. Knowledge is no longer possible on the basis of Aristotelian logic operating on sense experience. And happiness, what is it? Well, according to this view, it is eventual escape from life on earth, from the physical, from the body, and the uniting of one's soul with true reality. So supernaturalism in metaphysics, mysticism in epistemology, intense soul-body conflict and intense asceticism and antagonism to life on earth and ethics, these are the elements that came to dominate the whole era. Now, we've seen all these elements before in Plato. All the important philosophers at this time are heavily influenced by Plato. The period from the 1st or 2nd century BC to about the 6th AD, which is what we're on now, is usually classed correctly as a version of Platonism. But it's a version in which the worst of Plato becomes predominant. And the more pro-this worldly sides of Plato, the more Greek pro-reason sides, are progressively ignored and suppressed. Now, in general, there are two main trends within the philosophy from about 2nd BC on through about 6th AD. One was the continuation of ancient pagan philosophy, which we've been following since this course began. In other words, philosophy which did not become a formal religion with a sacred text, a priesthood, etc., however mystical in content it became. This pagan philosophy continued with a great deal of mysticism and very little originality right to 529 AD, when the Emperor Justinian officially closed down the universities in Athens and ended Greek philosophy permanently. And this pagan philosophy consisted of many various schools, generally revivals of earlier Greek philosophers of the more mystical persuasion, especially Pythagoras. There was a whole flourishing Neo-Pythagorean movement, and Plato. There was a flourishing Neo-Platonist movement. And you know that Neo simply means a new version of. Now, the other main trend, while ancient pagan philosophy was dying, was, of course, this is after the life of Jesus, the birth and rise to power of Christianity as the major philosophic force in the Western world. A process which took centuries. Christianity did not really achieve complete dominance until the 4th or 5th century AD. Next lecture, we will look at Christianity. But I want to conclude tonight on one pagan philosophy of this period to give you just a taste of what was happening to non-Christian philosophy in this era. You will then appreciate the caliber of competition intellectually which Christianity had, or more accurately, did not have. Please comment on the view that although certainty is impossible, probability is. Yes, that view represents a fundamental fallacy, in objectivist terms, the fallacy of the stolen concept. Probability means an evidential state in which there is a considerable amount of evidence in favor of a conclusion, but the evidence is not conclusive. In that sense, it is contrasted on the one side with certainty, in which you have conclusive evidence, and on the other side with simply possibility, in which there is some but not very much evidence. Probability is an assessment of the amount of evidence. Now, it obviously, therefore, presupposes the possibility of knowledge. All of the items of evidence which together warrant your statement of probability, are themselves certainties. They are pieces of knowledge in relation to the hypothesis that you are saying is probable. If you had no knowledge, you could never claim anything to be evidence, and consequently you could never make any such distinction as possible versus probable versus certain. Further, if there is no such thing as certainty, there is no meaning then to the phrase conclusive evidence, because nothing would constitute conclusive evidence. We could never form such a concept. If so, what would be the meaning of inconclusive evidence? If I told you all we have are non-gloops, and you said to me, what's a gloop? And I said, gloops are unattainable by man. You'd say, well, if gloops are unattainable, non-gloops are meaningless. Well, probability is the negation of certainty. It is inconclusive state of evidence. If we cannot attain conclusive state, then that becomes an empty concept, and no negation of it has any meaning. And in that sense, it's a complete stolen concept. There's much more, but I'm going to say some things about skepticism in Lecture 12. What was the argument of the skeptics to show that the syllogism is invalid, and presumably what is the answer to it? Now, this is an argument accepted by many British philosophers to this day, including John Stuart Mill, Francis Bacon, and several others. It claims that all syllogistic reasoning by its nature commits the fallacy of begging the question. You know, the fallacy of begging the question is the fallacy, I think we've discussed that in the question period, of using or assuming what you're trying to prove as part of the proof. And they say that the syllogism necessarily commits this fallacy. Why? Well, take the syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, if it is to be a valid argument, we have to be able to know the premises prior to the conclusion. But take the premise, all men are mortal. That is a statement about all men. Consequently, they say you would have to know independently that it's true of all men in order to be able to say it. But since Socrates is a man, you'd have to know it was true of Socrates to be able to say all men are mortal. But if you have to know it's true of Socrates to say that all men are mortal, then you're simply going in a circle to say all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is. And therefore, the conclusion of any syllogism, and indeed of any deductive argument, is in that way assumed in the premises, and therefore you learn nothing new by syllogistic reasoning. It's all circular. That was Francis Bacon's, one of his main challenges to the syllogism, and John Stuart Mill. What is wrong with this? What is wrong with it is a fundamental failure to grasp the phenomenon of abstraction. What is wrong with it is human beings are capable of grasping that all men are mortal without ever knowing that such an entity as Socrates existed. You grasp generalizations by induction from certain instances, and then assuming you have an appropriate methodology, generalizing to include the entire class on the basis of your concept of man. Therefore, you do not have to know anything about Socrates to validate the proposition all men are mortal. Now, true enough, the conclusion is implied by the premise, but that is the criterion of any valid reasoning. It is not presupposed by the premise, which is a big difference. Or as W.D. Ross puts this point, begging the question is when the conclusion is contained in the premise itself. The conclusion of a syllogism is contained only in the combination of the two premises, which have to be put together, and that's precisely what reasoning consists of. And therefore, the real meaning of it is they object to reasoning because it's reasoning. And if that were so, then of course you couldn't come to any conclusion. What is the status of this argument? All syllogisms are question begging. This is a syllogism, therefore it's question begging. Well, did they have to know that this syllogism was question begging to know that all syllogisms are question begging? If so, they're begging the question. You see what I mean? These people steal concepts right and left. It's grand larceny. What is the objectivist explanation of the liar paradox? The liar paradox has as much plausibility as if I were to come into you and say, a dog is and isn't an animal. True or false? Then if you say to me, well, you said he is, and I said, yes, but I said he isn't. So if he is, he isn't, and if he isn't, he is. You'd say to me, there is not a paradox proving anything about human logic. It simply shows that if you utter a contradiction, you are going to get contradictory results from it. Now, implicit in any statement that you make and put forth for someone to consider is the, unless you're engaged in open deception, is the prefix, the following is true. What I'm about to say is true. If the content of your utterance is what I'm saying is false, then your initial statement is, what I am saying is true and it isn't, which is simply a blatant contradiction. From that, you do not ask what follows. You ask the guy to go home and make up his mind. Now, there are 1,000 forms of this particular liar paradox. But they all come down to, they start with a contradiction and then blame human reason for it. And then, of course, Bertrand Russell attaches to such a alleged paradox and bastardizes the whole of human knowledge in order allegedly to solve it. But that's something you need to know modern philosophy for, to appreciate that such a phenomenon, such an abnormal phenomenon is possible. The mathematical logic of Russell and Whitehead I don't want to comment on here. In its philosophic foundations, it is thoroughly corrupt. Thoroughly corrupt. It represents an attempt to have logic divorced from concepts altogether. If you're a student of the course, I'll tell you simply this much. It represents an attempt to have logic on the basis of a denial of universals of any kind, Platonist, Aristotelian, or any other. The name for the viewpoint that there are no universals, the typically skeptic view on that question, is called nominalism. It's part of the lecture when we get to Hobbes, who is the first influential modern nominalist, and I will at that point make a big fuss about nominalism, about as big a fuss as I made about Platonic realism, and define it and explain it and give the arguments, and only on that basis will you understand Principia Mathematica and modern symbolic logic. But in that respect, it was the theory of universals that was started by the sophists and the skeptics, and that had its followers in the medieval period and was, however, peripheral until the Renaissance. And then Hobbes picked it up, and Berkeley and Hume and Locke, to a certain extent, took it over, and the result was the complete triumph of skepticism. But I'm getting ahead of the story here.